Hi there, Marcus here again. Week 9, amazing. Got a week off after this, so I'll attempt to make it snappy, but also engaging, this talk. All right, so first of all, I need to share screen, and we're going to jump to the question of urbanisation, particularly focusing on the 20th century. But, you know, it's important to know how we got here, right? So there we go, isn't that beautiful? The extraordinary 20th century. Why is it extraordinary? Well, it's because I was born then, and probably some of you were as well. Oops, here we go. Yes, but other than that, so much happened in the 20th century, one of which was, of course, massive population and urbanization trends. Okay, so here we have, you know, the planet surrounded by the human, what some writers call the ethnosphere and the technosphere, okay? So we've got technology, ethnicity. Of course, the question of global citizenship sits behind all of that. What does it mean now to be a citizen when, you know, if you're a citizen of a Greek city-state or a city of a medieval town or, you know, an Italian commune, that was one thing. To be a citizen now, of course, in the 19th century and 20th century was often thought of as being a member of a nation state. But as, you know, our awareness has grown, consciousness of the interrelatedness of all things and the way human history dances with the natural, if you want to call it that, we are rethinking citizenship again as a form of entanglement, but also a form of responsibility for not only the local where we live, but, you know, the global as well. So starting off with good old John McNeill, the reading for this week, he makes the point at very beginning, this is his opening statement, that the 20th century urbanization affected almost everything in human affairs and constituted a vast break with past centuries. Nowhere had humankind, thank God for that, altered the environment more than in cities. Okay, so we're faced, he reckons, with choices. Okay, I'm just remembering that I slipped this one in before this one. This is his opening lines to the chapter, not this one, which is on page 281. Yeah, so nowhere had humankind altered the environment more than in cities, but we still need to remember that back alleys, sinks and everywhere else are still natural environments. They're just a new form of urban natural. I want to make that point. This is where he talks about choices. This is the opening gambit for his chapter. Among the greatest distinctions of the 20th century, he says, and argues, seeks to prove, demonstrate through both anecdote and through statistics, as he says, were its powerful twin surges of population growth and urbanization. These trends reflect billions of human choices, and I think that's really important to understand, that it's choice. We've chosen, we've developed the world we live in. Often we choose unconsciously, of course, but part of studying history, part of doing the kind of course you're doing, also just part of sharpening your minds through academic study, is to become aware that choices are real, and that even though we may slide into them without even thinking about it, he says conscious and unconscious, you know, made for countless reasons. He seeks to demonstrate some of the key reasons, and I'm going to map some of those out for you as well. So here we've got, I love this idea of the sea of humanity. This is from a very new book that fell into my hands just the other day. There you go. Humanity's Moment. It's written by an Australian academic scientist working from ANU. And it's full of really useful stuff that I'm going to torment students in future courses with. But one of the things that she says, Joelle Gerges, is that, you know, the natural order has been cleared to make way for us humans, right? Our blue planet has become a concrete jungle. Thousands of cities now cover the earth, housing around 4.2 billion people. She's writing right now. This has been published 2022. More than half of the world's population, you know. So cities account for 2/3 of our global energy consumption, around 70% of greenhouse gas emissions, and also they consume about 70% of the world's food. They're incredible statistics. It's mind-boggling. So how we manage our cities, and I've got a number of people who are studying PhDs with me who are working on various aspects of cities, like regenerative economy, the donut economy, various forms of the Bitcoin and cryptocurrency type stuff. Quite a number of areas. So it's a key area to examine, and regeneration, regenerative futures, regenerative urbanism. These are all concepts that are worth exploring. Of course, this is a first year scratch the surface course, so I'm just sowing seeds, you might say. But this is really important. Now, the point, and the other thing that's really important about this book, even though this is a somewhat grim assessment, the subtitle of this book is called A Climate Scientist's Case for Hope. So she's presenting, the grimness of it, but at the same time, she writes very eloquently about going bushwalking in forests and so on. So it's a very interesting book, and I'm looking forward to getting deeper and deeper into it. The question, as an historian, especially a global historian, that we need to ask is, how do we get here? And really, in the previous centuries, probably going right back to Galileo and the Renaissance, of the European Renaissance, of course, is that there were a whole bunch of revolutions that occurred. Here are a list. The Enlightenment was an intellectual revolution. There was a political revolution, such as this one here. This is an image from the 1830 revolution, particularly in France in July. That's when things get hot and physically hot, as well as, of course, politically hot. And this is when the old king was tossed out and France returned to a republican form of government up until, what was it? I can't remember how long it was. But then in 1871, it returned to a republican government again, mainly because there was such a fiasco around the Franco-Prussian War, in which France suffered a horrible defeat to the Germans. But that's something else. Let's look at this list of revolutions. We've got the agricultural one, and as I was saying, brackets there, the second one, the first one being when we first domesticated ourselves and a few grains, sheep, cows, and so on. There's the urban revolution, the second one. What was the first one, you might say? You remember that guy Gilgamesh? You remember the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians who built those early cities, the Indus Valley city, the early cities in China, the cities across Meso and South America, and so on. So there was another urban revolution. They occurred at different times, depending on where you are studying. Very important for population growth, especially, was the scientific revolution, because that gave us medicines and helped us live much, much longer, which has obviously contributed to population growth. The Industrial Revolution has enabled us to feed one another more, and migration was very, very big here. There have also been the gender revolutions, bringing women into the workforce, generally in menial tasks. Sorry, ladies, but it led to a greater, access to human energy. And of course, I think this is really important, it is to me at least, is that there was also an aesthetic revolution, and aesthetics comes through in the aesthetics of industrialization, the way music was composed. I used to lead from here in earlier, when I used to really lecture, into, comparing Beethoven and Mozart, and then coming to Prokofiev and others, and Stravinsky in the 20th century, just to illustrate the tensions around aesthetics and the way aesthetics were worked out. Key, of course, to all of this was growth. And I like this quote from Jensen and Aaltonen, where they point out that growth, is a natural thing, okay? It is very human. And of course, I'm not talking about the growth of my belly. I'm talking about growth of societies, social structures, family structures, tribal structures, and so on. Of course, economic and political is what is in their sights here, and it is the result of many people working hard for the same goal. And I think that goes right back to that nearly opening quote, because I shuffled the things around, the slides around, from McNeil, talking about choice, human choice. The choice of billions of people have led to the kind of urban civilization we have today, whether that choice was conscious or not. So what are the ingredients then? Well, the ingredients of urbanization is one, this evolving concept of the citizen who dwells in a city. This goes right back to the citizen armies of England and France during their revolutionary periods. A citizen army is an army made up of people who are there not because you're paying them to be there, or they're because of feudal obligations. They're there because they are passionately engaged in the cause that they're fighting for. That's quite eloquent. So we also have a growing concept of human rights built around individuality. We'll touch on that a bit more. Growing levels of literacy across the planet, individuality, and this concept of genius. The concept of genius is hyper-individuality. It's a sort of Andy Warhol sort of comment of us all having 15 minutes of fame. But individualism is a key element here to the new concept of the citizen, but also of the urban populace and the urban profile itself. We've got really powerful concepts and commitments to various understandings of freedom and equality. Just think of the French Revolution, for instance, or the anti-slavery movements that swept across the Western world particularly. We've got new social visions of cooperation, different pro-sociality as, where is it? The Weirdest People in the World book, Joseph Henrich argues. And as I've already hinted, we've got conflicting aesthetics. We've got the aesthetics of order, and we've come back to that very much in the last 30 to 40 years. The height of 20th century music, particularly, was jazz or dissonance, the atonal systems of Schoenberg and people like that, which were very dissident and very hard for the average person to even relate to, So there was a rejection of certain kinds of order and an option or co-option of disorder and disordered elements. Now I didn't wave, I put my hand on it, the Weirdest People in the World book, so we've got this interesting situation here where we can flick back to that earlier reading. I think it was about week 4. The impersonal is urban. That's why I've got all these faceless people on the side here. Cities are mercantile, and so they follow what's called a lex mercantoria, which is a business law, you might call it, so the law of doing business, which is impersonal. You've got to have a different form of trust. Money itself is what you do, what people create, societies create in order to trade and so on, because you don't necessarily trust the person you're trading with, but you can trust the money. If they give you $10, you know it's $10. You know what you can buy with $10, or 100, or 1,000, or 1,000,000, and so on. Cities are also where education bubbles up very powerfully. This goes right back to all societies. Because cities house bureaucracies, they have high levels of literacy prevalent there. We have specialization, but we also have universities, and Henrik points this out, bring about prosperity. So in quoting him now, the breakdown of intensive kin-based institutions opens the door to urbanization. Okay, because a kin-based institution is where you might know 20, 30, 40 people intimately. You can't know 20,000, 30, 40, 50,000, 1,000,000 people intimately. So we need a new form, a new social contract, you might call it, so that with this breakdown, because of the mercantile, this extended trade networks and so on, we need other ways to trust and to believe, and we need other sets of values. And those values are linked up with this concept of the weird, the wealthy, the educated. I'm going to look at it from an industrialized, rich, and democratic. Yeah, so that's the that's a powerful acronym, and I think it does sum up something very unique about Western imperialist culture as it emerged in the 18th century, particularly came to dominate the world across the 20th and into the 19th and into the 20th century. And of course, is deeply linked with the emergence of cities, all right? So the charter town, and now he's talking medieval and Renaissance sort of period, which began developing greater self-governance. Okay, they're often dominated by merchants. You can think of the Italian city-states particularly as a really good example of this. Urban growth generated rising levels of market integration, and we can infer higher levels of impersonal trust, fairness, and cooperation. So the impersonal is something that obviously is key to urban identity. And many people that I've talked to over many years now have told me that one of the things they like being able to do is to be anonymous in a city. There's a lot of pressure on being known. And having lived in rural, small communities much of my own life, I know that for some people, that pressure is really oppressive, okay? Here's New York in 1920. So there are citizens in cities, but we also have new orders. And here I want to, of course, connect up with some of the earlier readings. We have the imagined orders of the city, that the imagined orders that Henrik is talking about, but this is, of course, Yuval Harari talking. We have the domestication of thousands and millions of people to fit into comfortably and happily and non-violently into cities. So that's Homo Puppy and Rutger Bregman, right? The city is the new social unit. It's a primary economic unit, and it drives so many things. One of the kind of imagined orders of this place is the Adam's concept of the invisible hand of the market, okay? So the invisible hand of the market orders things and will sort things out and ultimately rewards industry as in hard work and so on. There's a politics of the individual voter. So each one of these people here in this picture from 1920, one would presume that the majority of them were voters. Looking at the way they dressed, most of them are not labourers. They probably all had nuclear families. They were probably, many of them there that I'm seeing are men. And of course, that was quite a patriarchal period. The women only got the vote in the US around 1920. You should look that up just to see if I'm right or wrong, but I'm pretty sure I'm right. So we have the nuclear family and the new order and the loss of memory. It's really important to understand that in such a short period of time, 3-4 generations, most humans have ended up living in cities, but we forget what was before, except there's an emotional call or emotional need or emotional attachment to the non-urban, the rural, okay? But I'm going to talk about that in a moment, a bit more. All right, Convergence. We used to have a reading called The Great Convergence by Northrop. Trying to think of his first name, can't at the moment. Convergent evolution occurs before threshold. Now, convergent evolution is where you get a number of social economic ingredients around energy, around communication, particularly around political and social orderings, okay, that come together and change the identities of human beings. There's a popular mythic identity for Australians that we're great outdoors people, when we're tough and hard and we can hack, working in really rough rural environments. But most of us actually live in the cities. Australia is one of the most urbanized cities on the planet. Not cities, urbanized nations on the planet. Yeah. So energy regimes drive evolutionary trends. Where are we getting our resources from? What kind of energy? Is it solar energy moving forward, or is it petroleum, fossil fuel energy from the past? Or maybe we'll take a left turn or a right turn and suddenly embrace, as they're starting to do across Europe, for instance, nuclear energy again, simply because the Russians, Putin and co, are going to cut off, gas and petroleum supplies to Europe, and they're heading into winter. It's going to be chilly. Voters do not like being cold and not having energy at their fingertips. Why? Because that's what we're used to, right? I think that's really important to understand how domestication happens so quickly. We're already partially domesticated anyway, so it didn't take much as we were moved in, sucked into cities, for us to accept the order of the city, but also accept the conveniences of the city. Cultures evolve in the presence of energy regimes, which I think is really important. A regime is a unified, consistent, coherent system that works to achieve something. So regime is often thought in terms of politics, but you have economic regimes, you have industrial regimes. They're just ways that things come together in order to achieve some end. So an energy regime is you might be an agricultural regime, you might rely heavily on human slavery. Okay, that's another form of regime. Ancient Rome and the Greek civilization and many others would have fallen to pieces without slaves. Okay, so these are regimes that enable something to be achieved, and it's about harnessing energy in one way or another. Convergent drivers also foster new levels of complexity. So you can see I'm thinking energy and complexity. What I haven't mentioned here is collective learning, but it sits in the background as new forms of energy regime emerge. We have new forms of education. The reason why universities and schools are under pressure nowadays is because governments and their policymakers are trying to shape education to provide and hold on to an image of the citizen fitting into as an economic unit into a world that is vast, that is changing rapidly, which is leading to intensifications, not all of which are going to be ultimately productive of what the current system wants, which is really interesting. I just want to talk about, I'll just flick back to this for a moment. Evolutionary trends before thresholds, presence of energy regimes. I just want to talk a bit more about thresholds, okay? So the urban threshold, we crossed, and it was all over the papers years ago, that when we crossed from half of the world's population, more than half, should I say, living in cities. It's the first time in human history that this had. Normally in the past, in the earlier centuries, no more than 5-10% of a population might live in a city. So what we have are threshold in the David Christian world, and this little link here is a big history link, okay, to this quote. The coming together of new forms of energy that stimulate high levels of complexity. Sounds familiar? I should move. I'm not sure if you can see that or not. I can't see it. There's ingredients plus Goldilocks conditions equals complexity. This convergence generates a new state of being, a new thinking Yuval Harari, a new imagined order. And of course, as the orders that we imagine change, so does the way we configure our own identities and our practices of being me, of being human, and so on. So you can consider, this is the quote now from the Big History website, a threshold as a transition point. It is an event that creates something completely new. I think that's really important to understand. I just wanted to touch on that because to me, cities are something remarkable. I don't like them. That doesn't matter. The majority of people seem to like them. I've been to Brisbane about 3 times this year, if that. I can only think of once actually. But I did get trapped in Melbourne for a little while earlier on, which was not fun either. So the other thing I should explain here is they're talking about Goldilocks conditions. Goldilocks conditions are the ideal conditions. You know the old story of Goldilocks. This porridge is too hot. This one's too cold. This one here is just right. It's just a metaphor for just right. So a whole bunch of things that I've listed, some of those things had to eventuate for cities to become the ideal place for the majority of humans and for economic systems, political systems, educational systems, and so on. So that Goldilocks condition is, all those revolutions that I listed off, and, a whole set of new relationships around our energy supplies, the way we organize ourselves for complexity, which links up with the weird, especially the pro-social. That means no longer am I being tied to personal clan membership. It is now an abstract membership of a broader community. Usually it's the nation state, but you might feel more allegiance to Brisbane or to Queensland, to the nation state or Federation of Australia. That's the way we're going here. Just a few more points of clarification before we finish. So energy regimes are in flux. This is the current state, all right? I can't see that, so I've got to move myself out of the way. A regime is a coherent system of energy flows. You can compare an energy regime to cellular metabolism. In other words, take a breath for a moment. In other words, the way that a cell functions is a successful energy regime, just as my body, a collection of cells, functions in the same way, just as a community, just as a society. But where we're getting our energy from might be, different. Ultimately, all energy regimes on the planet, including my own body, are determined by basic energy regimes that are microbial in nature, cellular in nature, and generally photosynthetic in nature as well. Agriculture, as I noted earlier, is an energy regime. World history describes human social organization in terms of such regimes. How we access natural resources is a regime. Accessing primary resources are energy regimes. Okay. Trade is a part of energy regimes that distribute and consolidate resources, particularly consolidating where? Think of Gilgamesh, think of those very early cities, always societies are always in cities, right? And capitalism brings together energy regimes. But these are regimes, capitalism, it keeps them unstable. And this is really interesting about capitalism, is that it's based on instability, the rise and fall, the breakdown or breakup of systems that release energy in multiple ways. I always used to have facetiously, but in some level of reality, compare it to when a relationship, a marriage or whatever breaks up. The nuclear family splits. Well, these people together as a family required one fridge. As they split apart, you get two fridges, two washing machines, two vacuum cleaners, and so on, two houses. So this is the way that you could understand energy regimes in flux, as in capitalism. So, back to, I forgot to finish off my notes there. Back to John McNeill. He reckons that by the 1990s, and he published his book in the year 2000, right? Humankind accounted for about 0.01% of the Earth's global biomass. That's my body, right? And about 5%, and your body, of course, 5% of all animal biomass, ranking with cattle and far outstripping any other mammal in terms of our weight, if you put us all together and on a scale. The crowning success of the human species coincided with intense environmental change. But if you've done the reading, you'll know that John McNeill he really wants to assess that. Did it just population growth on its own? Did it cause climate change or environmental change? And his answer is a qualified no, but it's a major contributor. Why? Because of the systems that surround and maintain human success as a species. He reckons that fast and careless industrialization and urbanization probably mattered more than the rate of population growth itself. Population growth is a very crude measure of a species' impact. But what we do is in order to maintain our population growth, we strive for a standard of living, okay, which has led to careless industrialization. It's led to largely uncontrolled urbanization, okay, which have really impacted the environment in multiple ways, as he goes about showing. Now, with, all of this happening, we've got to look at how people currently are reimagining or challenging the dismal forecast for human planetary futures. this woman, he is writing about A Case for Hope. Well, I wanted to focus on solar punk and solastalgia. Okay, so solastalgia is, and there's a definition down here underneath the slide, but that link will also take you to a great short article on the conversation about solastalgia, which is really the existential or sense that we're missing something, that we're grieving for something. We're grieving for the home we had, even though we're in our home. We're grieving for something greener, We're grieving for a world that was lost, though we don't really know what that world was. Why? Because we're so present-centered as a species, largely because of the conditioning of the industrial world and the pressures of speed in our industrial world. So in 2018, I didn't write down the name of the author, Professor, the editor actually, this book on solar punk. Very early on, page 2, in the introduction, they write, while it is part of a larger movement that is solar punk, or climate fiction, the solar in solar punk has come to represent not only the ecological aspect of this budding subgenre, but also the idea of brightness and hope. So when we face rethinking energy regimes, rethinking the role that I as a global citizen have to play, it's about those small choices that John McNeill talks about at the very beginning. As a species, 7 point whatever billion we are now, and it's probably more than 7.5, every choice that we make, every decision to buy this or that, or to do this or that, or to drive a V8 that goes with petrol, as opposed to driving a hybrid or a Tesla or whatever. Every one of these choices seems pathetic and insubstantial, but cumulatively, just as every species achieves a cumulative mass, those choices matter. Solar punk is doing something else. It's reimagining. We talk about imagined orders. The thing about reality today is that most people, we've been trained or conditioned to see reality as a given. It is like this. Politicians are all, economics is all, my life, we keep on going like that. And we forget that there are alternatives. One of the great people that I really enjoy reading, and I think I've mentioned her before, is Anna Marie Brown, okay? Not Adrienne Marie Brown. She's been heavily involved in the Me Too movement, for instance, and she's saying, look, all forms of organizing. Now, she's talking demonstration organizing. She's talking about organizing groups of people to challenge governments or economies or whatever it might be about basic assumptions about reality. And she said, look, all of those things in her way of seeing it are all science fiction, because let's say the fact that women have the vote today would only have occurred because some individuals, mostly women, but some men as well, supported them, had a vision of a world which was more equitable, more inclusive, and so on. So what we have is a constant contestation around that. So this science fiction, what did she say? That we are shaping the future we long for and have not yet experienced. Solar punk is doing the same thing. She says, look, I believe that we are in an imagination battle. I think that is one of the greatest metaphors, and of course, this is where Yuval Harari is going with his imagined orders. That there's not just orders, it's plural. It's not just one order. History is about looking back at the past and going, oh my God, Graeber and Wengrow, that reading from week 3 or whatever it was, they are very much at the work of disturbing comfortable assumptions about the past. Why? Because the past is you could say it's an archive. The past is a repository of alternatives. This is really important. So this imagination battle is key, and so we can resist the kind of suburb we choose to live in, the nature of the house, whether we've got solar on the roof, all of that stuff. These are all minor battles, but then we come together and we can work with in community, not pro-socially, but standing side by side with other people and to feel connection with other people. And then, of course, to take that to an extreme is to stand beside a tree, to stand, and feel the earth under our feet. This is something that industrialized modernist concepts of the city have taken from us, our right to belong to the earth. And, you know, we end up with this battle between, well, it's about imaginations, but between what we see as the culture, civilizational world, and the natural world, where in actual fact they link together. So, you know, the last sentence here is really important. Our radical imagination, again, imagination, is a tool for decolonization, for reclaiming our right to shape our lived realities. This means, of course, that urbanization, as a given, as it's mapped out by John McNeill, is, or should I say more correctly, was the reality of the 20th century. As we're moving well into the 21st century now, it's about the choices we make about the kind of cities we want to live in the future. One thing I wanted to put, this is slide 16, and there are only 2 more slides to come after this. I wanted to say something. This is a photograph, and the article is there. If we go like that, yeah, this is a photograph of what's called a wet market. And it's where, you know, the COVID virus is said to have emerged from a wet market in China, in Hunan. Most wet markets don't actually sell, you know, monkeys and other wildlife things, but, you know, this is the association there. But what I wanted to say was that, look, in response to solastalgia and so on, people look back on their past and think about traditions. One of the reasons why the Chinese, for instance, are particularly committed to eating anything that moves, really, is because that's the way their narrative in their head, their identity is deeply tied to the consumption of foods that their great-great-grandparents ate. Okay, so wet markets thrive because of that, just like the Japanese say we've got our right to hunt whales and so on. So I just wanted to bring that in, because when we talk about imagination battles and so on, we're talking about identity battles. Who am I? How am I going to live my life? What values more? Eating the very last polar bear, or, you know, some sort of feral skunk or whatever it might be? Or is it saying, no, identity, that was, you know, the past and tradition, but some traditions do not serve us. And I think that's a really important thing to note. Week 10 reading is about migration. I'm looking, we've got there, Terra Incognita, 100 maps to survive the next 100 years. And the chapter comes from that book. And it's a terrific book, and it's on migration. But I wanted to touch on it now to sort of flag this, but also because John McNeill takes us back to migration. So he says, look, with declining transport costs and tightening integration of markets, that sounds familiar, that's the weirdest people one. After 1870, particularly, people moved about as never before. They frequently ventured into ecological zones about which they understood little. Australia's first 100, 150 years was very much like that. We didn't understand anything about the ecology of, you know, this continent. This, of course, has happened throughout history, he says, but in the 20th century, more people moved. They had more transformative technology, in other words, greater impact at hand, and in most cases, they had stronger links to markets or national planners, giving them incentives to clear more land. Now, I'm living up here in Witter, looking at the window there. If you were to take up a holding here and from, let's say, 1890 through to 1920, you would lose your holding if you didn't strip every inch of tree from the land so that it would be productive. Trees weren't productive, not like sheep and goats, or no, we'd want to have milk cows up in the dairy area, right? So yeah, so we could graze more animals, catch more fish, mine more ore than our own subsistence required. Why? Because the market integration meant that the milk that comes from here, the orchards and so on down your way on the Sunshine Coast proper, you know, that these places produced material that was going to feed a broader economy. At first, a state economy by and large, But as you know, market integration occurred faster, and transport increasingly was able to move food materials, for instance, from one end of Australia to the other, or overseas. You know, it sped it all up. So I want to close and say thanks, as always, and goodbye. And I just wanted to remind you, even though in week 9 we're going to have some Petra Kuchas being practiced, but you know, there's 1 or 2 of you at least who have informed me that you are already that you look at these early. I just want to make sure that you think through and strategize the Petra Kucha. I want to remind you that there are 2 clips up on the assessment page that will help you with that. And I look forward to seeing you after the break, okay, if I don't see you beforehand. All right, so take care and thank you very much. I'm going to stop share.